This is the VOA Special English Education Report. Some schools in the United States and other countries offer Chinese language classes with government support from China. St. Mary's School is a private college preparatory school in Medford, Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest. Carly Irvine is in her 4th year of learning Mandarin. She says, "Since China and America are working so closely and our relationship is growing more and more, I think it will be very important in the future to know Chinese." St. Mary's also teaches Spanish, German, and Latin. It added Mandarin in 2005. 2 years ago, it became the first school in the country to join the Confucius Classroom program. The program pays about half the costs of a teacher sent to the school in the United States. China's education ministry also provides books and other materials. St. Mary's principal, Frank Phillips, says knowing Chinese will help students in a world where China is quickly gaining economic power. But he admits to concerns in his local community. He says, "The question I always get is this a gigantic propaganda move? Is this an evil communist plot on the part of China? From what I can detect, having been involved in it for 2 years, I see none of that." In fact, the program has won the support of his local representative in the state legislature. Dennis Richardson says he has concerns about human rights in China, but he is among several lawmakers who have been pushing for more Chinese language education in public schools in Oregon. Young Ling, a teacher at St. Mary's, came from China in 2008. She says, "People do not know much about China, especially the latest development. So I think this is a chance for them to know more about China, what China is really like. It's quite different from what it was 20 years ago." The Confucius Classroom program is in about 40 countries, including more than 50 American schools and universities. A recent report said more schools in the United States are teaching Chinese and Arabic, although the numbers are still low. But it said foreign language teaching in public elementary and middle schools dropped sharply in recent years. Some schools say a federal law that only measures progress in math and reading has hurt language teaching. And that's the VOA Special English Education Report.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Education Report. South Africa has 11 official languages. If you want to say hello, it's Sawubona in Zulu and hello in Afrikaans. Now, South African school children may start using ni hao to say hello. The country's education ministry hopes to add Mandarin language classes in some schools. Mandarin is the official spoken language of China. That country is a major trading power for South Africa. The two countries recently signed an agreement that identifies 5 areas of cooperation. They include curriculum development, mathematics and science, teacher training, and research and development in basic education. South African officials have not said how much the Mandarin language classes will cost. Troy Martens works for the Ministry of Basic Education. She says the new partnership is extremely valuable to both sides. The part of the plan that has gained the most attention is a proposal to offer Mandarin classes in schools. Last year, a public opinion survey showed that South Africans have mixed feelings about China. It found that 46% of South Africans do not like the spread of Chinese ideas and customs in their country. And 60% of South Africans said they dislike Chinese music, movies, and television. But Ms. Martens says trade with China is more important than those feelings. She says it is extremely helpful for South African students to learn about the Mandarin language and Chinese culture. And she said, not every school will offer the language training. South African census officials have not said how many native Chinese speakers there are in the country. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal. From VOA Learning English, this is the Education Report in Special English. Tests of school children in South Africa show that they are not doing as well as they should. The government tested about 7 million children in 24,000 schools. This year, for the first time, testing included students in the 9th grade. There was a sharp drop in average scores from 1st grade to 9th grade in both mathematics and language. The news was not all bad, however. The country's basic education department said young students appeared to make gains compared to last year. This is especially true of 3rd graders. But the gains seemed to have disappeared in the 9th grade. At that level, only about 2% scored more than 50% in math. A spokesman for the Basic Education Department says although the results have been criticized, they show hopeful developments. Students from poor families scored well compared to wealthier students. And he said the study confirms that school attendance is high. Thabo Kupa serves on the executive committee of the Youth League of the ruling African National Congress. He said the results for the 9th grade are disappointing. He added that the test results call for officials to act. This year, South Africa's Basic Education Department was accused of failing to provide textbooks to students in the poor northern Limpopo province. An employee was accused of dropping about 700 of the badly needed books into a river in Limpopo. To educate an estimated 12 million students, the nation spends 207 billion rand, or about $23 billion. Education is South Africa's biggest budget item, and education spending is set to increase. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal with the VOA Special English Education Report. On July 9th, South Sudan becomes the world's 193rd nation. In January, almost 99% of voters chose independence from the North. South Sudan will also be one of the world's least developed nations. This follows years of war and neglect by the Sudanese government in Khartoum. South Sudan is about the size of France, yet it has only 50 kilometers of good roads and almost no public electrical power or other basic systems. Illiteracy rates are high. There are estimates that more than 80% of the population cannot read or write. There are 5 universities. 3 of them moved their operations to the north during the war. The southern government has brought most of the students back. Officials estimate that about 25,000 students have registered at the 5 universities. Classes were supposed to start in April, but the Ministry for Higher Education in the South has now moved the opening date to the middle of May. The government pays for food and provides housing for students. But Higher Education Minister Joseph Ukel says finding enough space was one reason for the delay. Another issue is money. The government in Khartoum will pay for the schools until July. Mr. Ukel says the southern government's proposed budget for this year does not include any money for the universities. Then there is the problem of teachers. Almost 75% of the lecturers are from the north. They are not likely to travel to the south to continue teaching for their schools. Mr. Ukel says his ministry has asked southern Sudanese teachers outside the country to return. William Dang heads a commission supervising the return of 90,000 former fighters to civilian life. He says most of the soldiers who have come out of the Southern Army need education and training. He said, the skill they only know is soldiering. Now you must train them with life skills, such as carpentry, making bricks, and also small agriculture or microfinancing. Only 4% of good land in South Sudan is being farmed. Millions of people need food aid to survive. The head of Juba University, Agre Abate, says his school can play a big part in training agricultural specialists. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. You can find transcripts and MP3s of our reports and other programs at voaspecialenglish.com.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Education Report. One World Education is a group with a program in which teachers develop teaching materials based on student writing. The students are in middle and high school and write essays about cultural and global issues. Students are invited to write about an issue they find important. Then, professionally developed learning materials based on chosen essays are used in schools to teach other students. Eric Goldstein is the executive director of One World Education, based in Washington. He says the nonprofit group has worked with over 1,500 student writers. He says 350 teachers use the One World curriculum. He says the essays can serve as a writing and learning guide for thousands of students. Mr. Goldstein is a former classroom teacher himself. He and another teacher began forming plans for One World education in 2006. The group publishes a study unit each month from August through May. Each unit of the curriculum starts with an essay called a One World Reflection. The subjects have ranged from single parenthood to protecting rainforests to exploring Arab cultures, says Mr. Goldstein. Layla Kunesh of Washington wrote about her feeling that media reports in the United States are often unfair to Muslims. A learning activity based on her reflection called for students to collect examples of media stories and discuss whether or not that was true. Layla was chosen as a One World Student Ambassador last year. 12 students are chosen yearly. Their reflections are published on the group's website with learning activities and reading and writing aids. For VOA Learning English, I'm Laurel Bowman. From VOA Learning English, this is the Education Report. Students at St. Louis University have launched weather balloons into the sky above the city of St. Louis, Missouri. The United States Space Agency, NASA, is paying for the project to measure ozone gas. It is part of a study to learn more about air pollution and our climate. The students are getting the opportunity to carry out a real scientific experiment. They used a laptop computer and a radio receiver outside the St. Louis Science Center to communicate with data gathering devices on the balloon. Before launch, the students tested all the instruments and attached them to the weather balloon filled with helium. Gary Morris is a professor at Valparaiso University in Indiana. He is the lead trainer for the nationwide study. The professor says NASA wants more information on ozone because of how it affects our atmosphere. High above the Earth, in the stratosphere, the ozone layer keeps harmful ultraviolet radiation from reaching the ground. But in the lower atmosphere, emissions from cars and other sources like petrochemical plants form ozone pollution and smog. They cause unhealthy air conditions that affect breathing. Jack Fishman leads the ozone study at St. Louis University. He says new requirements that decrease pollution have lowered ozone levels in American cities. But he notes that pollution in remote areas continues to increase. He blames industrial activity in East Asia for that pollution. Jack Fishman says polluted air is being blown across the Pacific by air currents in the upper atmosphere. He says ozone pollution has slowed the growth of farm crops and forests. For VOA Learning English, I'm Laurel Bowman.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Education Report. Teachers and parents usually call attention to the pictures when they read storybooks to preschool children. But a study published in 2011 suggests that calling attention to the words and letters on the page may help a child's reading. The 2-year study compared children who were read to this way in class with children who were not. The children whose teachers most often discussed the print showed clearly higher skills in reading, spelling, and understanding. These results were found 1 year and even 2 years later. Shane Piasta at Ohio State University was an author of the study. She said most preschool teachers would find this method manageable and would need only a small change in the way they teach. They already read storybooks in class. The only difference would be increased attention to the printed text. If you get children to pay attention to letters and words, it makes sense they would do better at word recognition and spelling. But research suggests that very few parents and teachers do this in a systematic way. The report appeared in the journal Child Development. More than 300 children ages 4 and 5 were observed for the study. The children came from poor families and were below average in their language skills. There are different ways that adults can talk to children about print. They can point to a letter and discuss it and even trace the shape with a finger. They can point out a word. They can discuss the meaning of the print or how the words tell the story. And they can talk about the organization of the print, for instance, showing how words are written left to right in English. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Education Report. It was not just another day in a classroom recently for some young people in Washington, D.C. These student volunteers visited the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History to test a new program. Some students explored the mysteries of human bones. Other students examined an insect under a microscope. The student volunteers were among the first to help test a new exhibit, a new showing at the museum. The program has an unusual name, spoken as Curious and written as Q?RIUS. The exhibits are designed so young people can learn about science by taking part in experiments. The program combines the newest technologies and scientific equipment with more than 6,000 museum objects, both real and digital. Students from local schools helped develop the exhibit, which combines science and art. Teachers will bring their science students to the exhibit in the mornings. In the afternoons, the exhibits will be open to everyone. Many of the students already have their favorite activities at the center. 13-year-old Nate said he liked exploring the containers with dinosaur bones. Addie is 12 years old. She liked the bee display. She found that the bumblebee and the yellow bumblebee were very different when she examined them under a microscope. Another student, Ben, said he enjoyed an exhibit that lets people use their senses to learn. He said, for example, that a butterfly smells a little like tea. Involving the senses, smell, touch, hearing, is one of the exhibit's major goals. Curious can also be found online. For VOA Learning English, I'm Laurel Bowman.
This is the VOA Special English Education Report. Last week, we told you that the number of foreign students in the United States had reached an all-time high. More than 671,000 foreign students attended an American college or university during the last school year. So says the latest report from the Institute of International Education. Many international students choose large schools, but a growing number of them are attending smaller ones. Douglas Bennett is the president of Earlham College, a liberal arts college in Richmond, Indiana, that actively seeks foreign students. He says Earlham is a small college, just 1,200 students, but about 15% of the undergraduates come from homes outside the United States. This is very high for an American college or university. Doug Bennett has written several articles aimed at helping students choose a college that best fits their needs. He says one of the important things to consider is the size of a school. He says Earlham College is small for a reason. He says, we're that small because we think we educate much more effectively and much more powerfully. Of course, there are also good arguments for attending a larger school. Many big schools are widely recognized, and in some cases that might lead to more job interviews than a degree from a lesser-known college. Larger schools also have more money. This can mean more resources for education, recreation, and research. In addition to size, Douglas Bennett says there are other important things to consider. For example, which programs at the school are the strongest? Some schools have stronger programs in the sciences. Others are stronger in the liberal arts. Also, what do the school's top students do after they graduate? What kinds of activities are offered that might add to the educational experience? Are there sports teams? Something else to consider is the kinds of services that a school offers for international students. But Earlham College President Douglas Bennett says one choice tops all others. He says, the most important choice you make in going to college is who you choose to be yourself. If you're prepared to bring your best self to college, then it hardly matters where you go to college. And that's the VOA Special English Education Report.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Education Report in Special English. Speaking Kurdish was a crime in Turkey until about 20 years ago. More recently, the government has eased some of its restrictions on the use of the language. Now, the government is letting some schools offer Kurdish language classes. Halil Chechen teaches beginning Kurdish to medical students at Dicle University in southeastern Turkey. He says people are happy about the changes that are now being put into place. But he says people have been waiting a long time, 50 or 60 years. One student says he welcomes the classes. He speaks only a little Kurdish, he says, and he sees the classes as a big step, but they are only the beginning. He thinks learning Kurdish should be required, especially in health education. He says it would be even more successful if Kurdish were taught starting at a young age. The university is in the mostly Kurdish city of Diyarbakir. It is not far from the border with Syria. Syrian Kurds seized control of their region from Syrian government forces earlier this year. Now, children are learning Kurdish as a first language. Kurds in neighboring Iraq have had that right for years. But Turkish Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan recently rejected calls for Kurdish education in the mother tongue. He called it a terrorist demand of the Kurdish rebel group known as the PKK. The Prime Minister says there is no such thing as education in the mother tongue. He says the country's official language is Turkish. Kurdish politicians face increasing pressure if they violate language restrictions. But the Kurdish language and culture are increasingly making their presence felt. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal.